Welcome to Everything is a Primary Source, the podcast where we get history through pop culture. Today's episode will see us treating the video rental store that you used to have in your town like a world-class history museum, as 1999's Blast from the Past is treated as an artifact of the era. I'm so glad to have Jeremy Eversole with me once again, this time to talk about a movie. Last time you were on, Jeremy, we talked about Neon, which you were just saying was your life's passion, and it was the avenue that brought me into the Society for Commercial Archeology. And do you see any kind of parallel between Neon, Roadside Americana, and what the SCA does and this movie, Blast from the Past from 1999?
Yeah, absolutely. I just rewatched this 2 nights ago because I don't think I had seen it in quite a while. One of these movies that came out when I was I would have been in high school when it came out, and so in the vein of those movies, and loved it and bought it. Yeah. But I looking back, I can see this thread in a lot of the movies that I like of this kind of engagement with the past and how places change over time. I'm thinking specifically in this movie, which of course is about, maybe for folks who aren't immediately familiar, I guess the very basic premise is a family goes into a fallout shelter in 1962 because they think a bomb has been dropped on Los Angeles, and they set the lock for 35 years. And then the son, who is born immediately after they go into the hatch, lives his whole life in the fallout shelter without any awareness of what's happening up above. After 35 years, comes back up and experiences all of the changes in the world circa 1999 in a kind of innocent, optimistic, kind of Pollyanna-ish way, and that of course is charming, and there's a romance, and we all live happily ever after. But in a wonderful story that has been used in many other situations. But to the direct question, I mean, one of the things that happens throughout the early part of the movie is that the home in suburban Los Angeles in the Valley that in 1962 is this quintessential ranch house, of course, not long afterwards gets bulldozed, and they build a malt shop right on top of it. And then we see the transition of that malt shop from 1960s teenager hangout to 1970s kind of druggy disco hangout that becomes this kind of skeevy 90s punk rock club, all kind of in stereotypical fashion. But in some ways, that's kind of what we look at in the SCA, is how these buildings, how places change over time, and what that says, about that place, about the society. And certainly that is a theme in the movie. All of the humor, the entire setup is about this kind of fish out of water story, and how the 1960s are so different from 1999. And wouldn't it be interesting if we displaced someone from this era into this era and they had no idea what happened in between? So certainly I see that in, like just like Back to the Future, another one of my favorite movies.
And I think that really, and that's a wonderful summary of the film, really is what the material is made from. 1999, this was, like you said, this is not the only movie like that where they are doing this compare and contrast between different time periods. I remember when Blast from the Past was being advertised and seeing the trailers for it, and they didn't make it really clear that it was all just a big dramatic irony misunderstanding as to why the family went underground. I remember seeing the previews for it and seeing Brendan Fraser on his character of Adam being lifted up on this elevator, and some kind of mention about his mad scientist father. And so I thought, like, the way that the trailer made it seem like is that it was a some kind of experiment that his father had done, that he
Mm.
intentionally kept his kid underground for no other reason
Mm-hmm.
other than to see how well a kid that would get no other influences, like basically all of his education and understanding of the world around him ends at 1962, how he would
Mm-hmm.
do in the real world. And of
Mm-hmm.
course,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, we do get that, but there's a pretty rational. I mean, it's far fetched. It's science fiction, but it's pretty. It matches the time period at least. I don't know if what Christopher Walken's character does is actually possible. He's like growing fish, and the wife has a full supermarket that she can
Yeah,
use,
yeah,
and
hydroponics under
yeah,
growing plants underground, and which we're trying to do more of now.
yeah, it's like this was, they really show the best circumstances of what could have come from people's paranoia and fears during the Cold War, during the height of the Cold War in the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
of making this fallout shelter like better than what's on top of
Mm-hmm.
the soil. So once I finally got to see the movie, I'm like, okay, I see why it's happening, and that's super clever. I really think so.
Mm-hmm.
Big part of the material is actual history. The movie begins with really good exposition. I like the way
Mm-hmm.
that the characters at their cocktail party are talking to each other about the dad in particular,
Right, right.
and Calvin, and that so it's not like we learn about it another way.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
suppose they could have made this movie and done an opening montage of him building the fallout shelter,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
supplying it. But instead, they start with this cocktail party, very 60s, very
Yeah,
carry over from the 50s kind of thing.
right, right.
And then one of his friends comes in, and JFK is going to go toe to toe with Khrushchev right now. It's on TV, and that's what sets the whole thing in motion. So,
Right. Yeah.
it
And the whole opening credits too, with just
yeah,
having these newspaper articles kind of set the scene. Like, we are in a time when we're afraid of nuclear disaster, and Calvin is kind of set up as this lovable but slightly crazy, like the lovable mad scientist. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yep.
it was like he has his act together, and he takes care of his family beyond what would be expected of somebody. And honestly, if he hadn't taken them underground, they would have died. I mean, a plane does crash on their
Yes.
house. So
Yes.
while that causes him to think that an actual bomb has been dropped in LA, he would not have survived if he hadn't built that thing and had that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
preparedness, if he hadn't been that the forethought involved. So he is a brilliant man, and then when he's down there, he does his best. He falls in love with his setting a lot more than his wife does. Sissy Spacek's
Mm-hmm.
character is
Mm-hmm.
is probably the best. She plays that role so well, of just like, she goes along with it for a point, but then right around 12, like year number 12, she's like, I'm done, like I need to get out. So a lot of
That's
these movies in the 90s had this, let's see how the 90s compares to previous time periods.
mm-hmm.
You mentioned Back to the Future, 80s,
It is, yeah.
50s. Uh, and then I think of like Austin Powers,
Right.
came out, is that 97 or so? I'd
That,
say.
yeah, late night, because I remember seeing Gold Member, which was the last one in like 2002 or three, like right when
Yeah,
it came out. So it would have been late 90s really for the Austin
I
Powers
think it's
movies.
around.
Yeah.
And the first one in particular really, they don't, I mean, I guess throughout the movie is a running theme where he doesn't understand how things have changed in lots of different departments
Mm-hmm.
throughout the
Mm-hmm.
90s. But there's a scene in particular where he's like, he apparently goes out and buys a Reebok pump, and he's like pumping it, and it blows up in his face, and he's trying to listen to a CD on a record player, and it's, and he doesn't know how it works. And then there's one of my favorite movies of all time, is the Brady Bunch movie, uh,
Uh,
which is also set in LA. And, so Blast from the Past, to explain it, the Brady Bunch, they don't. They're just like this family
mm-hmm.
that's stuck in the early 1970s for some reason. And everybody around them is in the 90s. And they're like every day's a struggle for the Brady's because they still don't understand the 90s. Like it's some kind of weird space time continuum kind of thing. There's a very science fiction feel to it. Another one is Frequency, which
Mm-hmm.
has a young man, the character in the 90s talking to his dad through a what do you call it, ham radio,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
the in the
That's right.
60s. And what I'm getting at is, do you think it's odd that probably one of the scariest times in American history, the 1960s, especially the Cold War type stuff, um, is shown is as such a simple time in Blast from the Past? What do you make of
mm-hmm.
that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting because it is, I mean, I think we have this tendency as a species, I think, to romanticize the past, and nostalgia is a very powerful tool, and so we remember the things that we loved or that our parents have told us positively about these time periods. I mean, I think about like growing up in the 80s and 90s, I hated malls. Now I love malls. I
Yeah.
remember like the good parts about them because they're not here anymore, to the degree that they were.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certainly in this movie. I mean, this is 1962. I was actually surprised when I turned it on and saw 1962, because in my brain, which had not seen the movie in years, but I have the soundtrack, which I listen to more frequently, and it's just a great soundtrack of 90s alternative and
Yeah.
90s throwback swing music, and a little bit of Perry Como, which would have been old fashioned in the 60s. But in my mind, it was it was definitely the 1950s. The picturing the house and the
Mm-hmm.
dad, and so when I saw 1962, I was surprised because it has this kind of late 50s feel in my mind. So all I'd say that it's before Vietnam really really gets heavy, and as the civil rights and these types of things are kind of growing, but it's kind of just on the cusp of some of these big dramatic changes
Yeah.
that are kind of leaving the 50s behind, and heading into the more turbulent 1960s, where we're really kind of thinking a little bit more critically, and that we this kind of era of optimism kind of based on blind consumerism, and this kind of championing of American values coming out of the Second World War, and in opposition to these communist values, and the Cold War obviously as a setup here. Um, but yeah, it certainly does poke fun at something that at the time, I'm sure, was quite serious. Like the possibility of nuclear
Yeah.
war is not exactly something that people were probably making jokes about at the time. And of course, these fallout shelters are real things. Are they as elaborate as this? Certainly not. I had the good fortune of living in Woodstock, Vermont previously. There's a national park there, the Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historical Park, the only national park in Vermont.
Hmm.
But it was owned by Lawrence Rockefeller most recently and his family. And I don't remember exactly when it was built, but at the time that his brother was governor in New York and basically ordered fallout shelters to be built across New York, Lawrence, even though he's over in Vermont in solidarity, builds a Rockefeller style fallout shelter underneath this home that they live in, one of his many homes, but the home that he lived in there in Woodstock, Vermont. And even a Rockefeller fallout shelter was not as elaborate as the one in this movie. So I doubt there was much quite like the level of sophistication in the movie, but still something that was being built. If we look around our cities today, you still see these yellow and
Yep.
black circles that say Fallout, remnants of where these places still exist and were built around cities to provide escape.
I think about one of my all-time favorite movie is American Graffiti, and
Mm-hmm.
that is it was made 12 years after 1962, but it says, the question is, where were you in 62? And I think that also, the things that became synonymous with the 60s hadn't arrived yet. The Beatles hadn't arrived yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
JFK was still president. He hadn't been assassinated. The it's just like, so every decade, and it's a very 20th century thing, and we're still doing it in the 21st century. We like to measure ourselves in nice, even 10-year increments. Um,
Right.
Very 20th century of, and maybe even before that it started, but just like, this is the 60s, and even in the time period, but especially in retrospect, it allows for us, like, to just dump into one big category. All right, 60s equals flower children and Vietnam
Right.
War stuff, and the Black Panthers, and kind of like that TV show that I think was on in the late 90s called The 60s. And
Mm-hmm.
it made it seem like everybody was either a hippie, a Vietnam War vet, or
Right.
a Black Panther. There was no other room. And I would, as a kid, so I graduated high school in 1999 when this movie came out. And
Mm-hmm.
one in particular, we had a homecoming float that we built. It was called Turn Back the Clock. That was the theme of it. And since we were
Mm-hmm.
the class of 99, we had this dial thing that took the year 99 and flipped it over to 66. And
Clever.
it went really fast though, so it was like nobody could actually see what it said, but we knew what it was. And all of my classmates, when we were marching in the parade and getting ready for it and stuff, started dressing up with tie-dye shirts and peace sign headbands and hippies, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents, who were about 18 years old, 1966, my dad was 18 years old. He's like, nobody dressed like that back then in 1966. He's like, and they gave me, my mom had her old John Lennon leather hat thing, like this beanie hat, and I had just like a turtleneck sweater on. They're like, now you look like you're from 1966. I'm like, really? So I was like I was the odd man out walking down the street. But my parents, like, yeah, we didn't know anybody. Like, they went to college in New York City, and in the late 60s, like at the height of
Mm-hmm.
supposed hippiedom, they're like, we didn't know anybody dressed like that. We didn't know any hippies. That wasn't really something that took
Mm-hmm.
place until, it became popularized anyway, until like after Woodstock in 69. So I guess in a way we want to think of the 60s. By 1999, maybe this movie in a weird way is acting as setting the record straight for all of us Gen X millennial. I guess millennial would be the target audience, but it's like, no, actually the 60s did have a lot of this in it, and there was a lot of innocence, and there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
conservatism, and there was it wasn't the wild scene, that Woodstock was maybe perhaps the culmination of the 1960s, but only for a very small part of the society. That
Mm-hmm.
most
Mm-hmm.
people were listening to Perry Como,
Right.
as he is at the beginning. Why do you think they chose LA? What is it about Los Angeles that makes this the appropriate setting for when they go down? It's one thing. When they come up, it's completely different.
Los Angeles certainly stands in for lots of other places around the country or world. So it certainly would have been possible for the filmmakers to shoot in LA, where many movies do, because it's right there and there are great tax incentives. But they made the decision to keep it in Los Angeles. I think, I mean, there has been, and I think I have at many points in my life kind of bought into this ideology because I grew up watching these movies in the 90s and 2000s, many of which were set in Los Angeles. But I think in the popular culture, because of the time period, well, and also, I mean, factually, from the time period, so much of the architecture and the cultural identity in Southern California, in the popular imagination, is from the 20th century. So we think of Los Angeles as the place with this space age Jetsons Googie style 1950s and 60s architecture, and I think that that is played out in the popular culture. Thinking of Southern California as a mid-century place that has that character, but it is also factually true. And if I want to find a Googie coffee shop in Massachusetts or Vermont or New England here, where you and I both live, we have to hunt. We may
Yeah.
find some older diners from the 1920s or 30s, but we don't have the kind of the mid-century stuff that's left, because we as a culture in New England have decided that the time period that we want to represent is, colonial, 1700s, 1600s. So even if we had neon signs or remnants of that mid-century period, we've erased them, and created an image of the original, because many of the buildings here were built much before that. In Southern California, a lot of those buildings from the mid-century, that is when that area was becoming built up. So those buildings remain, and so because of that, I think it makes sense for a movie about the mid-century to be set in Los Angeles. And as is the case anywhere, it's not like all of the malt shops that used to be there are still there. And
Right.
Los Angeles is a place that changed dramatically. We can see it there, as in other places. The suburban kind of tract family homes being commercialized over time. Um, Looking at the kind of the car dealership across the street from the punk club in the 90s, where, I mean, it
Yeah.
looks, I've been, the most recent times I've been to Los Angeles a few years ago, I mean, still looks that way. I mean, the place has changed in many ways. So I think Los Angeles in film especially really kind of sits in as the microcosm
Yeah.
for change, because Los Angeles also has an image, I think, of constantly reinventing itself.
That's true. Yeah, that's an absolute great point, because it's been growing, and I think in the '60s, it was growing just as fast as it was throughout the rest of the 20th century. And to your point before, I mean, if they had set the movie in Boston or something like that, it was 1962, suburbs of Boston, they go under the ground. They might rise up in 1999, suburbs of Boston, very little. It's not as drastic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And LA had really become, especially throughout the 90s. I mean, you think about the LA riots,
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
before that, of course, the cause for that would be the Rodney King uh, beating and then subsequent trial. And then you have the O.J. Simpson car chase. And on top of that, just the way that, unfortunately, Hollywood, both the industry of the movies as well as the actual place Hollywood, was deteriorating,
Mm-hmm,
is
mm-hmm.
becoming a lot less stars in their eyes, and it seemed to be getting seamier and things. People are getting stories from Hollywood about kind of the creepy things that happen there to
That's
help
right.
people's careers. And so I think the attitudes by the 90s about LA, and I'll go back to the Brady Bunch movie with this. The
Mm-hmm.
whole opening sequence of that movie is driving through 90s LA, and you see piercing and tattoo shops, people driving their cars in smog, and signs saying gang riot war going on.
That's
Have a
right.
nice day.
Mm-hmm.
They're really demonstrating their knowledge of LA as being this once land of great promise
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
has
Mm-hmm.
declined incredibly before the entire nation and world's eyes. Like that, even if
Mm-hmm.
you've never
Mm-hmm.
been there, you definitely see a different Los Angeles by 1999 than had existed in the earlier part of your lifetime. I think that scene when Calvin emerges for the first time is probably the most critical part in that story of
Mm-hmm.
this is what the 90s look like to fresh eyes. To
Right.
so the
Mm-hmm.
last view of the United States, the last view of Los Angeles, California that Calvin ever had was pre a plane falling on his house, was a really nice view.
Right.
Everything was
Right.
perfect. Suburbia, everything is orderly, everything was bright, shiny. And then he emerges on one of the rare rainy days in
Right.
LA
I know. Yeah.
and
And the next morning it's beautiful, but I said it's pouring rain in Los Angeles, and in the valley. I said like the you would think it would be Skid Row. I mean, the way it's portrayed, but
yeah.
that this is out in the valley.
Well,
But
and to outside observers, I've been to LA once and it was 6 months ago. So I don't really, and when I was there this past summer, it like things came together a lot more than like I start, oh, that's where,
mm-hmm,
that is in proximity to something else. Cause I'd always just
mm-hmm,
heard the
mm-hmm.
names bandied about in media. Cause like you said before, that's the hub of entertainment, so of course they're gonna film as much as they can around
Right.
that area. And so we've all gotten to know Southern California through way of media. um I wouldn't know. I would just
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to take this movie's
Right. Right. Right.
what they're saying is like, yeah, I guess that's what the valley looks like.
Yeah. To the
you
average
know
person, yeah, the valley. You don't know that the valley in Skid Row it takes you an hour and a half to get from one place to the other if you're not. Yeah, it certainly does seem. I mean, they have for comedic effect. They as is often the case. Like we use extremes, yeah, and stereotypes in a way to heighten the difference. Yeah, we have this very quintessential early 1950s suburban kind of paradise conservative, communist hating mad scientist coming up in this very extreme version of what parts of Los Angeles, would have looked like at the time in order to show just how different, the message certainly is, society has deteriorated over time. Despite the fact that, Eve working in these kind of seedy places and, staying with her friend who lives in, this beautiful craftsman home that would cost, probably 2.5 million now. I mean, then it was maybe only
yeah.
800,000, but yeah.
It's Dave Foley, he could do what he wants.
Right.
Which I wanted to say, because we haven't really mentioned any of the other characters very much, but Dave Foley is a chameleon. I mean, that guy can
Mm-hmm.
play any character he wanted in the 1990s. I mean, he went from, of
Mm-hmm.
course, Kids in the Hall, where that's what he did on the show. I mean, all the guys in Kids in the Hall were constantly looking and sounding different skit to skit. But then news radio, he was in the It's Pat movie, which nobody outside of my house has ever seen.
Hi.
But also is another LA movie, because I think cost
Mm-hmm.
effective, and so you get to know a little bit of Los Angeles culture by way of non-show busy Los Angeles by way of that movie. He's in countless other stuff as this character, that character, but he always is super convincing. And so as Eve's
Mm-hmm.
friend that she lives with, they don't really give much about what he does for a living. He must do well, because he
Well, he builds websites. I remember, so
yeah.
he's kind of presented
Okay,
as
yeah, so
this,
computer
as
guy, yeah.
yeah, so like early tech guy.
And
Yes, yeah, but I was wondering. I didn't do any research on this, but it felt uh, somewhat early for uh, the trope of attractive female who lives with her gay best friend,
yeah.
which Yeah,
I'm
I see.
curious.
Yeah, at
Yeah,
that time, if that was happening
or if
more
this was
than
like
I
a
remember.
ahead of its time kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if it was just kind of showing how modern she is, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
just another way to sneak
Mm-hmm.
in the modern balance to, and quick little joke where, oh, he's gay. Oh, good for you, because he thinks gay in 1962 just means
Yeah.
heavy, and
Thanks
uh,
for being so happy all the time.
and
He
he's like,
says.
we try, yeah. And so it's like, I think it might have been just a way to 90s it up a little bit more, like,
Right. Right.
a
Right. Right.
girl that
Mm-hmm.
could easily, in Adam's, when they were both born technically, but definitely when, in his youth, somebody like Eve would have been married by the time, and with several kids, by the time that they
Mm-hmm.
meet. And,
Mm-hmm.
but meanwhile, she's living paycheck to paycheck, taking one crummy job after another, doesn't seem to have
Mm-hmm.
much direction in her life, very Gen Xy,
Mm-hmm.
stereotypical Gen Xer. Has extensive knowledge about baseball cards, so she's able to ward him off from selling off his collection for like $100 or something, $1,000
Mm-hmm.
to that skeezy baseball card guy. Um, so yeah, maybe that whole component of where she lives and with whom was just another way to make sure that it's documenting the 90s properly.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I'll give this movie another credit, they don't overdo the 90s either. I think that was a trend, especially as we got closer
Right.
to the millennium, or maybe even more just early 90s, but they were like, this is the 90s, this is the 90s, like we'll have to, you know like the little girl in Jurassic Park, like, I'm a hacker, like I
Right.
can get into the mainframe, and there's all this like useless technology that it really dates the movie, which they don't really get into a Blast in the Past. They could have. They don't even mention Y2K. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people were supposedly, I don't know how true this is, but I remember people were, so reportedly doing a similar Fallout shelter type thing as we approached the millennium, because they were
Mm-hmm.
afraid that everything would just fall apart and they would need to survive on their own for a while off the grid and all that business. They So that might be another reason why this movie was made in the first place, as just kind of like, hey, we've been here
Mm-hmm.
before, don't let this happen to your kids. If you go under the ground for a while, you might be running
Yeah.
after fool's gold here. One thing interesting about the audience is that there are actually two versions of this movie that were put out on VHS. One is the
Oh,
original
interesting.
theatrical release, and the other one it's an edited version. I think it got a lower rating, a PG rating, versus the original, which might have been
Mm.
PG-13. And that in itself kind of tells you who they were directing it for. Uh, they
Mm-hmm.
they had all the elements, as we were just saying, with Eve's character in particular and her way of life. Um, they had all the elements of a Gen X crowd movie, but by trying to make it so that it can be delivered to a younger audience. What does that tell you about that time period of the late 90s, early 2000s, that they made a almost like a kids version of the same film?
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I did not know that fact. I do remember watching it and thinking the language was stronger than I remember. Yeah.
Especially the
Yeah.
baseball card scene.
Right. Yeah. I in my mind, for some reason, I have an F bomb as, and I maybe need two of them before you get an R rating or something. And it certainly doesn't feel like an R rated movie. Um, but yeah, and it's I think the '90s were a time, even in the late '90s when there's still this concern about kind of the corruption of the youth, and the satanic panic and all of these things are a decade earlier, but there's remnants. I think of that, and it may just be the PG movies do well. I mean, I think there is this kind of there's a I can understand the impetus to kind of highlight the innocence. I mean, in a way, the message of the movie, one of the messages as I see it, is that there's a place even in this crazy jaded world for optimism, and politeness and seeing the good in the world. And that is, a message I think that can be appealing for a PG audience. I mean, the cynical side of me says, well, what, you do what you need to do to get the rating that you think is going to bring in the cash. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that's part of it.
The family viewing edition, as it's called, came out in 2001. So
Mm-hmm.
2 years after the movie's release. But that just tells me that, yeah, the uplifting version of, that component of the story is what they really wanted to go for. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it came out, I'm assuming that the odds are it came out before 9/11. But we oftentimes forget the kinds of problems that the country and the society and the culture faced pre 9/11 as well. You were
Mm-hmm.
mentioning, I mean, one of the things in 1999 that really set the tone for, especially for youth, was the Columbine massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And people
Mm-hmm.
were immediately looking at the media relationship with that, and with Marilyn Manson music. And I mean, he was
Mm-hmm.
gone after as if it was him involved directly in it,
Mm-hmm.
as being like a component of it. And that satanic panic thing that you're referring to definitely extends to him. He
Mm-hmm.
he was he was and that kind of music. And so, yeah, the youth rebellion that we were hinting at before, that really started in the late 60s, was extended in its own way throughout the 90s. We were
Mm-hmm.
both, like you said, we were both in high school in that era, so we remember the way that, especially with the internet showing up, parents
Mm-hmm.
were concerned. They wanted to try to find ways to um, get us on the right track, to make sure
Mm-hmm.
that we were heading into adulthood with our head on our shoulders, and everything
Right.
as best as it could. And this movie is a good vehicle for that, because it it definitely takes jabs at the saccharine sweet Americana of the late 50s, early 60s throughout it. I mean, Adam does come across as a big goof a lot throughout the film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And but it also, and definitely by the end of the movie, Calvin is like really creepy. If you find
Mm.
a girl, bring her down. He's like,
Right.
whoa, what's going on here? Uh, but when they bring it all around, they make a point of saying, yeah, the Cold War ended without a shot being fired. We were still in that age. Again, I'll reiterate, pre 9/11, so era from end of Cold War
Right.
to, it was mainly just domestic issues that people, cults and
Mm-hmm.
domestic terrorism, and that kind of stuff was happening. So it was like, let's use this as an incubator in a way, to get these kids. Yeah, we recognize the goofiness, the cheesiness, if you will, of the time period that we're showing you here, but at the same time, there's a lot of merit in their wisdom, and that you shouldn't necessarily reject it altogether.
Right. 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 Yeah. I mean, the last line of the movie is something to the effect of, he still says Eve is talking and about Adam, and so he still has these, naive ideas, and but I sometimes I just don't tell him, because why break his spirit or something, because like the message, like, yeah, this kind of saccharine view of the world may not be accurate, but maybe there's something to it, and
Yeah.
don't let our kind of crumbling modern society break your spirit. And I certainly, I mean, as I'm thinking about it more, it makes sense in this time period of, in the 90s, stickered CDs, because there's bad words. I mean, there is this kind of sense I remember from from growing up, in the kind of religious culture that I was a part of, and still maintain some of that. But there was an element that like the that bad words and sex are the things that are going to ruin you. So if you take those few bad words out of this movie, you take the mention of sex out of it, and it can be seen as a parable for kind of a 1960s version of clean living as the way to go. And I certainly remember the culture of the bleeped out versions of the song. You can still have the thing, but just take out the problematic elements
Yeah.
of it. And I don't know that has totally. I think that still exists today, but not to the degree I feel like it did at that period.
The last thing I want to bring up, and I want to see if you think this still works in the movie or not, is the club scene, the nightclub scene, where they go to a place that for some reason is just called Club 40s. And welcome to Club 40s. They have Humphrey Bogart impersonator, I assume, is introducing, maybe every 10 minutes he gets up there and does his thing about welcome to Club 40s, and then it's swing music is going on, which swing revival was in full swing in 1999. I mean, and so it's like, it's kind of funny because, Adam gets to demonstrate two of his skills that you see in development as a kid, fighting and dancing in the same club, same night. But I'm just curious, why do you think they launch him back 20 years before he was born into Club 40s? Like, what do you think there's anything to that, or are they just riding that trend of swing music coming back?
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. I hadn't thought of that component, and as looking back into the soundtrack, I was like a quarter of the soundtrack is swing music, and
Cherry Pop and Daddies.
Yeah, and I certainly remember that time. Like, and I'm in middle school, high school, so at my most kind of impressionable time around pop culture, and hearing this swing music appear and feeling like, oh man, what is this? Like 1940s stuff music, coming back, and I didn't love it at the time. But yeah, and I think it works from a story perspective too. We see him in the fallout shelter learning to fight from his dad. His mom comes in and takes him away and teaches him how to dance, and then dad comes back in and cuts to mom and dad dancing, and he sees this as and I think this is kind of the first time that they show him kind of longing for love when he sees his mom and dad dancing. So it's a way to kind of pull those strands together, I think. He sees his mom and dad dancing and falling in love. He's then falling in love with Eve himself all these years later, and shows this kind of quintessential masculine and feminine skills that he learned while underground as a way to put them on display. And in the way that the swing music is almost a more of a throwback. In the 60s, he's learning how to do this dancing, not because it's what the kids of 1962 are learning. It's his parents who were growing up and listening to this music and learning this kind of dancing are teaching him how to do this 1940s dancing that they learned when they were teenagers to him in the 60s and 70s. And so I see it's a way to kind of tie all of that together, and for him to show off his skills. If he had gone to a modern dance club, it would have had to be, I think of Night at the Roxbury, the 90s club. It would have been a fish out of water scene, placing it in there.
I'd be curious to see if they had a previous rendition of the script that had him going to a different club, and then suddenly that swing music culture, that big band revival showed up, and the writer's like, oh, perfect, I'll just stick them in
Yeah.
here, because that
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
Because there's also from the same time period that movie with Vince Vaughn and John Favreau, Swingers, in
Mm-hmm.
which dabbles, at the very end of that. And there was, particularly places like LA, there was a 1940s subculture that existed among Gen Xers in that
Yeah.
era, that they were dressing like the zoot suits, or at least elements of that, and predate going even before rock and roll, looks to them.
Yeah.
And I
Oh
remember
yeah. Yeah.
quizzing my wife on that one time. uh we were just kind of joking about, yeah, remember when swing music came back for a couple minutes in the 90s? Like, what was that all about? And she's like, well, it makes sense. She's like, we were fascinated by not our parents. Like, we'd already gotten pretty bombarded with our parents' time period of 60s and 70s stuff. We were, especially since our grandparents were aging on and probably passing away, and the greatest generation, um, people were like fascinating with their youth.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if it is, and I'm with you on that, like, I was not taken away by the modern, with Brian Setzer, I'm like, stick with the Stray Cats. I'm not, huge on your orchestra, and same thing with, all the other, neo swing groups, but because they were very 90s, it was just blaring music, and it just was not
Mm-hmm.
as easygoing as the 40s was. But it does make sense. We're like, so it might not have been handpicked for that movie, Necessary Blast from the Past. It may
Mm-hmm.
have been more like, yeah, we have, as a greater trend going on of, you're not the only one who is a holdover from another era. Let's,
Mm-hmm.
you're
Mm-hmm.
even kind of a fish out of water, and this, yeah. But like you said, um he's learning from his parents. I mean, he's basically a product of the 1960s in stasis. Like, he never actually
Mm-hmm.
gets
Mm-hmm.
influenced or informed by any other time periods. So
Right. And
I just thought I'd bring that up because I it's like a pretty big scene, and especially
yeah.
since that's when Eve starts to fall for him,
Yeah.
is,
Yes.
when she sees him out on the floor, with the two women, and gets all jealous and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Really, there might be something to this. I mean, certainly it's set up as if nobody expects him to succeed. Yeah, he goes over to talk to the women, and they fully expect. Troy, the friend, says, I don't know if I can watch this," and they fully expect it to go horribly.
yeah.
Yeah, and are surprised. I'll say this impetus still exists. I was interested when I was living in Milwaukee. I met some folks from the Milwaukee Vintage Style Society, a group. Milwaukee certainly
Oh
not
yeah.
Los Angeles, but a group of folks who regularly get together. Yeah, or many of whom wear clothing from the 20s, 30s, 40s on a regular basis, and get together to kind of celebrate this era. And a whole other topic, but I think it is interesting, the time periods that we pick to romanticize, or how
Yeah.
the this nostalgia for the 40s that's coming out in the 90s. Of course, I think then continues to accelerate, and within 5 or 10 years, the whole kind of growth of hipster culture, I think, is going back another 20, 30 years to
Mm-hmm.
the late 1800s, early
Yeah.
1900s, where we're really romanticizing mustaches
I know.
and
Barbershops and
newsies
yeah.
hats, and this kind of like this search for. I think we always have this search for authenticity, and we
Yeah.
go back to the time when we believe that authenticity existed, and look for ways to try to recreate it.
Well, what a
Yeah.
better era than 1999. I mean, you can't think of a better time period than 1999 for them to do that, because it's like a decade, a century, I
Mm-hmm.
should say, a century in review. We're looking
Mm-hmm.
back on the 20th century, and we're taking from it and trying to prepare for the next one and the next millennium.
It's certainly interesting to think about. My mind immediately goes to, like, holy cow, this movie was 25 years
Yeah.
ago now, and well, what does that look like now? And doing the math, so there's the movie says that it's 35 years. So I guess it's made in 1999, but I guess maybe it's supposed to be set in 97. But if we say, 37 years, back from today is 1987. It's like if we were making this movie now, what would it look like for someone to go underground in 1987 and come back up in 2024? And in my mind, because I was alive then, and I was only 5, but or 4.
There's probably
5.
something like that on Netflix that we just don't know about. So some of those
like what would it look like?
I'll actually end with this. I just looking up something. It said I saw a article from Variety from last year. It said Alicia Silverstone is interested in a Blast from the Past 2.
Yes.
So that's exactly what they would do with it.
Yes.
They pick up where they left off. And I mean, we're in 90s nostalgia era anyway. Fashion is, and people seems to be really interested in 90s stuff. So that might be something, and maybe this podcast will inspire them to actually go for it.
If they made a good burger too. If they can make a good burger too,
they can make a good burger too.
They can make a Blast from the Past,
even if it's direct to Hulu or something like that. But Jeremy, thank you again for joining. I had a great time. I had a blast talking about Blast from the Past. So, thank you once again for being on the EPS podcast, where everything, including 1999's Blast from the Past, is a primary source. Talk to you next time. Please rate and follow this podcast wherever you are listening to it right now, and share with everyone you know. You can follow the Everything is a Primary Source podcast on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Show notes, which expound on each episode, and essays about history and pop culture can be found on Substack. The hub for all these things is everything-history.com. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.